Our reading from Proverbs is a part of one of three speeches that are attributed to women in Proverbs. The first word in this reading this morning is khok-moth in Hebrew, which is a form of khok-maw. And the most interesting thing about bringing up the Hebrew word is the meaning. And it's only relevant if the meaning can tell us something deeper. Now, the meaning is wisdom, so our translation is good. It's accurate. Wisdom cries out in the street. But when we cross-reference the English back to Hebrew, we get some thought-provoking insight. And we can explore the deeper insight, the deeper meaning of the word. Khok-moth also means, or is used to mean, every wise woman. So when it's used in other contexts, it refers to, that wise woman who told you what to do, and I think the rest of the sentence is, and you didn't listen. As we go through the text, it's clear that wisdom surrounds us, and we have a choice about whether or not we're going to listen. Sometimes listening to the divine wisdom or God speaking is hard because it goes against the culture. It means speaking up when the crowd is shouting wrong, hurtful, or damaging words. Keep this image from Proverbs 1, every wise woman telling you the right thing to do. Keep this image in mind. The question we have to answer is whether or not we're prepared to listen and to act when we hear God's voice. Doing what God tells you to do can be really hard. Now, if you'll indulge me for a moment of personal testimony, I would like to tell you about a time when I was wrong. Not all of the times, we don't have time for that. Just one in particular, and didn't listen to the clear voice of a very wise woman. In this case, there was an actual woman who said publicly the right thing, and I joined the chorus of people who ignored her. We're going to come back to that. Every generation endures some cataclysmic event. Everyone remembers where they were when it happened. My grandparents remembered where they were when they heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and a wounded nation with those unforgettable words, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy." Pearl Harbor changed history, and nothing was the same after. The Russian philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev writes, "Every generation has its own goal, its own justification, its own meaning." And Pearl Harbor marked a generation. Pearl Harbor gave a generation that goal, that justification, that meaning. And for a moment, for a few years in fact, everything was focused on winning the war. My parents' generation was marked by the assassination of JFK. It ended the innocence of the 1950s, and everything changed. People who were alive in '63 can remember exactly where they were when the president died. And the list goes on. Major events disrupt our lives in the days of broadcast television. Now I'm dating myself. They would interrupt the regular programming to cover big news stories. I remember in 1981 when, much to my chagrin at the time, the show, whatever I was watching, probably a rerun of Gilligan's Island, was interrupted because there was an attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. I remember in 1986, I was in school when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. What do we do with this information? What do we do with these epoch-marking, cataclysmic events? In many cases, we learn. NASA revised some of the safety protocols after the Challenger disaster. And life is full of choices. When we see warning signs or we see that something could happen, we can pay attention and learn. We can adjust what we're doing and change course, or we can ignore them. We have a choice. Proverbs 1 celebrates Lady Wisdom. She cries out. She raises her voice. She calls. She speaks. The invitation to listen in Proverbs 1, 20-33 suggests the notion of God's wisdom surrounding us all the time. It's in the street. It's in the squares. It's in the busiest corners. In other words, wisdom is where we are. And we have a choice how we respond when we see it. The majority of our reading in those verses is about the consequences of hubris. When we ignore the signs that surround us, we reap the whirlwind of calamity coming our way. Lady Wisdom says, "They will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me, but I will not be found." Why won't God, the possessor of all true wisdom, answer? Why would God hide? Because we made a choice. The choice isn't irreversible, but our decisions have consequences. Looking backwards is always easier than looking forward. When we assess the past through the lens of the present, we bring the insights of everything we learned. Until the Challenger exploded, most of us, and we have a NASA engineer, a retired NASA engineer in the congregation who I was thinking about when I was writing what I was about to say, and thought he's going to say, no, there were some of us at NASA who tried to warn them. But what I was thinking is most of us couldn't conceive of the space shuttle exploding. Maybe there were some scientists at NASA who tried to sound some warning bells. But as soon as the disaster struck, that possibility was no longer something we could ignore. Everyone knew it could happen, and we wanted to figure out how to keep our astronauts safe. The praise of wisdom in Proverbs 1 includes the bitter pill of ignoring warnings and signs. The passage points to one of the consequences of ignoring wisdom. They shall eat the fruit of their way. We want comfort from Scripture. We want it to tell us everything's going to be all right. The challenge just continues to be looking ahead into the future, because we only get to make decisions in one direction. Moving forward. Time always moves forward. And Lady Wisdom calling out tells us about this moment, right now. We can act on her wisdom and have a more fruitful future, or we can ignore it and eat the fruit of our folly. Yesterday was the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and like so many others, I remember exactly where I was when the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Melanie and I were talking about that yesterday and recounting how when that first plane hit, and maybe some of you had this experience too, it was sort of like, oh, I remember talking to some other people. I was working in finance at the time, and we were on the trading floor, and we thought, oh man, some guy in a Cessna ran it. Poor person died running in, got lost in the clutter of New York and ran into one of the tall buildings. And mostly, I'll be honest, at that moment, I was annoyed that it was delaying the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange, because part of my responsibility was order fulfillment. And so I knew that customers would be calling momentarily, why aren't my orders being filled? But we watched the TV, and when that second plane hit the South Tower, there was no longer any way to ignore somebody was doing this. If you don't remember 9/11 or weren't born yet, the world was different before that sunny September morning. It was a gorgeous day, not unlike this. There was no such thing as the TSA, and boarding flights was way easier before 9/11. So much has changed. So much has changed since then. The Patriot Act gave the U.S. federal government broad surveillance privileges that exist to this day. There's been much, much more anti-Muslim violence in the U.S. since 9/11. It's tragic. When we look back, we should be honest. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had been trying to pull off a terrorist attack for several years. With the benefit of hindsight, various intelligence officials can clearly see where we missed the signs. Rather than indicting ourselves or the U.S. counter-terrorist agencies, we can learn, and we can learn as we look forward. Right after 9/11, our country came together. The president's approval rating was 85%. I lived it, and I still have trouble remembering and imagining our country that united. We could have done anything in that moment. Instead, we declared war on Afghanistan. And I remember struggling with declaring war on the country of Afghanistan because the country hadn't attacked us. I mentioned that I worked in finance at the time, and I remember also trying to reconcile going to war, starting a war when we had just had some massive tax cuts. Wars are incredibly expensive. Our gospel lesson offers us a glimpse into one of the disciples truly seeing what seems, or with the benefit of hindsight, seemed to be so obvious. Jesus asked the people who he was, and his disciples answered. Then when he asked who they thought he was, Peter said, "You're the Messiah, you're the Christ." That's the moment when somebody sounds like they're getting it in real time. Now, Jesus told him not to tell anybody because the time wasn't right yet, but the point of understanding in real time touches Lady Wisdom's voice when she cries out in the street or the square, or in 2001 in United States Congress. Which brings us to a time when I was wrong. As followers of Christ, we all, I hope, know Jesus' teaching to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's Matthew 5:45, if you want to look it up. We know Jesus undermines the Leviticus eye for an eye, fracture for a fracture, tooth for a tooth law. Instead, he says, if anybody hits you, turn it off for the other cheek. It's Matthew 5:38-40, if you want to look that up. Now, I'm not trying to use bits of the Sermon on the Mount to serve as a proof text for pacifism. Unconditional love is central to who Jesus is. Yet, after 9/11, in 2001, we, the people who were trying to create a more perfect union, wanted vengeance. We wanted blood. We wanted those who perpetrated this to pay for it. And despite my very minor, I don't want to overemphasize my read of the situation, my very minor misgivings of declaring war in Afghanistan, I was shocked when Representative Barbara Lee stood up on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives and outlined reasons that we shouldn't declare war on Afghanistan. She was the only person in either House of Congress to vote no on the war resolution. In that moment, if I had been better attuned to what it means to be a Christ follower, Jesus the Christ, I would have affirmed her vote. I had no authority, no platform, but I at least would have said it to my friends. Maybe I would have written her a letter or written to my own representative and said, why don't you say no too? As I thought about the 20 years since 9/11, and I thought about Proverbs 1 and this notion of wisdom, and I thought about khok-moth every wise woman. Barbara Lee's courageous stand against war came to my mind. None of us could have truly known the quagmire the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan would become. And right now, we can't go back. We, like always, can only go forward. We can learn, and we can make decisions for the future. We can remember that day in 2001 when everything changed. And we can look forward and think about what it means to be a Christ follower today. The world needs us to do that. The world needs people like us to reflect the love and light of Christ in this world, in this divided world. God calls us to move. God's not calling us to sit on our hands, to sit back, to stay quiet until somebody else does something. God doesn't call us to the safe path. Whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. It was in our gospel lesson this morning. God calls us to be the light of the world. And today, someone needs you to hear Lady Wisdom, to hear that voice, and to go against the chorus of negativity and polarization, division, and even against our own nature, and speak the words of God's love. Speak encouragement. Speak inclusion. Speak constructively. Lady Wisdom still speaks. We have a choice. We can either listen to it or ignore it. Amen.